Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we have my top 10 books of 2022. I had a really good reading year. I discovered that fantasy definitely is my genre. I read so much fantasy this year. I'm gonna go over my stats in a year-end review video, probably coming up later, so I won't talk much about that. But I read so many amazing books this year that it was both easier and more difficult to come up with my top 10 of the year. So I have a top 10 that actually changed right before I filmed this video. Now, I'm filming this halfway through December. Is there a possibility that something that I read in the latter half of December will surprise me and become a top 10 favorite? There is a slight chance. But I knew with the one book that I changed on my top 10 that there was a chance of this becoming a favorite. I don't foresee that with any of the other books that I have. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and film this top 10 books of the year. I'm also not going to do a most disappointing books because I had a lot of average books, one or two disappointing books, and those really never are my favorite. So before I get into the top 10, which I have stacked right over here, I'm going to go through all of my 5-star reads leading up to the top 10. So if there's a book that you know that I loved that I don't mention in these 5-star reads, then so you can assume that you watch a little further and you'll see it in the top 10. Now, I will say I'm going to have to put up several images off to the side. I haven't decided which side, obviously, because I haven't edited yet. But I will have to put up several of those because I don't have physical copies of those books. I got them from the library and I haven't purchased them yet. With all the books that I purchased, it's kind of surprising that I haven't purchased them yet, but they're on the list to purchase soon because if it's a 5-star read, I want it in my collection. Okay, so here's how I determined my top 10. This whole year, I have been using CAWPILE, the system from Book Roast, and I have really enjoyed it. But what I did to come up with this list is I sorted the whole list by the writing, which when you do CAWPILE, characters, atmosphere, writing, plot, intrigue, logic, and enjoyment, it comes up with a number out of 10, which then translates into star ratings, either whole stars or half stars. I sorted it by that number and then just looked at the ones that were at the top. And then for those that had the same average, I made some personal adjustments and judgment calls as to where they should rank. What I'm going to do, starting with the lowest of the 5-star, I'm going to go through and I'm just going to list off all of the books that I read that I considered 5 stars, and then I'm going to talk more in depth about the top 10. So first we have Daughter of the Deep by Rick Riordan, The Lightning Dreamer by Margarita Endel, How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr, Los Fuentes del Silencio by Ruta Sepetys, Nevermore by Jessica Townsend, Wind Daughter, Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, New From Here by Kelly Yang, Redemptor by Jordan Ifueko, Wolf for a Spell by an author I can't remember, The Dragon's Promise by Elizabeth Lim, Darius the Great Is Not Okay by Adib Khorram, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, Midnight in Washington by Adam Schiff, A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare, and The Bone-Shard Emperor by Andrea Stewart. Now we come to my top 10 with one honorable mention. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these books and why I thought so highly of them and why they are my top 10. So we are going to start with the honorable mention of The Cat I Never Named by Amira Sabik Al-Rayes. I first heard about this book from a former colleague of mine who gave it as an option for her students. She taught 8th grade and she taught 8th grade ELA. This is a young adult memoir telling the story of a young girl, a young Bosnian Muslim who was trapped in her home in this area during the breakup of this Balkan country. And it's something that happened within my lifetime. I was very young though, so I wouldn't necessarily have understood everything that was going on. But even today, it's not something that's talked about a lot. And the parallels between how the West handled what was going on here and how the West has handled and dealt with Ukraine, absolutely stunning. This was published before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the timing was stunning. It does read young because it is targeted towards young adults, which is part of the reason why it's the honorable mention and not part of my top 10. But I have already recommended it to people, and this is just a stunning book. So I have a confession to make. There are 2 books that I don't have here, and I forgot to look at my list as I was going through. And that means that what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to talk about them and rearrange my numbering. At number 10, we have a book that actually is in my classroom right now. And that's the reason that I'm going to put up an image on the screen. It is a middle grades book that I read because of the middle grade, children's and middle grades category last year on the Goodreads Choice Awards. And that is The Shape of Thunder by Jasmine Warga. In The Shape of Thunder, there's a very tragic event that starts off page before the story starts. And that is a school shooting. And it intimately involves the 2 main characters who were former best friends. One of the characters, it was her brother who committed the act. And the other character, her sister, was killed. And of course, this sunders their friendships. The family dynamics are completely thrown into disarray. Throughout this, both girls end up becoming obsessed with the idea that if they can find the shape of thunder, they can turn back time and go back and fix what happened and what happened to their families. And it's so powerfully told, so hard-hitting. It's just a brilliant book. At number 9, we have All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir. I first heard this book talked about by Jenny at The Story Ain't Over, and immediately I knew that I wanted to read it because last year I discovered Sabaa Tahir with her An Ember in the Ashes series, because the 4th book in that was on the Goodreads Choice Award list, so I binged basically the whole series. I could not put those books down. So I already knew that I loved her writing. I didn't know what this one would be like because unlike An Ember in the Ashes, this is not fantasy. This is contemporary. And she talked about how personal this book is and how based on her life this is, and it showed in the text of this book. It deals with 2 characters, former friends. They've had a falling out by the time of the start of this story. And they're both Pakistani Americans, but they're dealing with a lot of hard things. The relationships, the way that different people have been treated both in their past and in the present, and the way that it weaves relationships together. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, but it's also hopeful. And it's told so brilliantly, and it's a stunning book. It also is a National Book Award winner. Highly deserves that. At number 8, we have They Went Left by Monica Hess. Last year, no, that was a couple years ago now, I read The Girl in the Blue Coat by her, and it was my first introduction to her, and I found myself absolutely stunned by the book. So I knew when this came out, I wanted to purchase it. This book tells the story of a Holocaust survivor after she's been released. She was rescued. She now faces the incredibly difficult task of putting her life back together. And the title comes from the fact that when they first went into Auschwitz, people went 2 different directions. She went to the right, the rest of her family went left. And she is plagued by something in her mind, something tragic that you know has happened. And this story is the unfolding of it and how she deals with it, and going back to try to discover this and coming to grips with both the trauma that happened to her and also the decisions that she made while she was in the concentration camp. It's gorgeously brilliant. At number 7, we have The Last Cuentista by Dona Barbara Higuera. Number 1, this is a gorgeous cover. So that aside, I would have wanted to pick this up just based on this cover. Secondly, I heard this talked about very highly by Angela over at Literature Science Alliance. And I found myself absolutely intrigued, captivated by the idea. And I would never have guessed, based on this cover, that this is a sci-fi story. I'm not a huge sci-fi fan. Like, I can find really stunning books, but the fact that a sci-fi made my top 10, unexpected, completely unexpected. In this story, the main character, it's set just a few years in the future, where there's a comet that is now slightly off of its normal path and is going to hit Earth. But they know that it's coming, and they are preparing for it. And they're sending people off to this place that they've discovered is habitable, but it takes a really long time to get there. So the people that they are sending to repopulate that area, they put into stasis. And there are people who, there's going to be generations on this spaceship taking care of the people in stasis. And the main character is one of the ones who's going to be put into stasis. But she has to leave behind her grandmother, who she absolutely loves. And her grandmother is a storyteller. That's what cuentista in Spanish means, storyteller. And she's taken on this aspect from her grandmother. The turning point of the book is when something goes wrong in the loading of this last spaceship. And there is a collective that wants, a group that wants to wipe out all of the stories and the histories that have come from Earth and start fresh. They believe that humanity will have a better chance. And that means when she wakes up, she's the last person that remembers any of these stories. And it's so well told that a book that's not necessarily my type of thing, hands down, this is an amazing book. As I look at my list, this is my top middle grade of the year. At number 5, we have a book that is on its way to me now. I cannot believe I haven't purchased it yet. And the fact that I don't own one of my top 10, and that is Echo North by Joanna Meyer. The Echo North, I read during one of the readathons that I participated early on in the year, and it was Polar Fantasy, because I chose the team that had JDV Reed. I'm a Patreon of hers, and this is a highly rated Polar Fantasy. And I have never gotten so wrapped up in a book as I did with that one. Now, Echo North is a retelling of the myth East of the Sun, West of the Moon. I think that's how it's said. Beauty and the Beast is also a retelling of the same myth. And so you saw a lot of those threads woven through this story. And Beauty and the Beast is one of my favorite Disney stories ever. And in this book, Echo is horribly scarred by a wolf when she's a young child. And she has to deal with that her whole life. But then her family falls on hard times. And her father goes out to try to make some money. And it doesn't come back for a long time. And so she goes out to try to find him. And she finds him near Frozen, but also encounters the wolf, who's about to take him. And she makes a bargain with the wolf to spend a year with the wolf, wherever the wolf lives, in exchange for her father's safety. And of course, the wolf takes her back to a very magical place where he is actually not even the big bad guy. He's being controlled by something else. And the way it unravels, it's so captivating and ethereal. I cannot wait to actually own this book. And that means that at number 5 is Brandon Sanderson. I'm holding up my top rated book, my favorite of his books that I have read this year, and that is Words of Radiance. Prior to this year, prior to March of this year, I had read Brandon Sanderson books before, but I hadn't realized the implications. The Brandon Sanderson books that I had read before, I had read 2. One that I hated, it's the book that I don't talk about, the series that I don't talk about. I'm being ridiculous, it's Steelheart. And the other was Skyward, because Skyward was on one of the SCASL lists. But I didn't put together Brandon Sanderson as an author, like his whole backlist and all of his adult works. Then came the Kickstarter in March, and I had heard more about Brandon Sanderson, about Mistborn, about Stormlight Archive from watching BookTube. And by March, I had heard a lot about it, and I knew I'd wanted to pick up Brandon Sanderson's work. The Kickstarter came, and I'm like, I want to get in on this, but I'm not going to back something. I'm not going to commit this amount of money without having read some of his works. And so thus started my journey to read all of Brandon Sanderson's backlist. At the time of filming, I am one novella, a partial novella collection, and Rhythm of War away from doing that. So I have read a lot of Brandon Sanderson books. And I have discovered that what I love about Brandon Sanderson's writing is his intricate plotting and the way that he lays the groundwork for these huge payoffs in the end, and the way that the Sanderlanche gets rolling. And when things start coming together, hands down, some of the things that are right key to my enjoyment of literature. This is my favorite of the Stormlight Archive. I have not yet read Rhythm of War, which I've heard is really good, but a lot of people still put Words of Radiance as their top. Things come together in such a brilliant way in Words of Radiance. And the fact that Brandon Sanderson as a whole is only 7th on my top 10 of 2022 is pretty remarkable. He is now an auto-buy author, a favorite author for me, and I have read pretty much his entire backlist in this year. Number 4, The Firekeeper's Daughter. This book was so highly talked about in 2021. It, I believe, won debut for Goodreads Choice Awards last year. Of course, it's partial cover buy because I was drawn into it. This cover is stunning. The artwork on it is amazing. This book is more of a mystery thriller than, and that's not my typical type of book. But what appealed to me in this book, and I talked about the fact that as I was getting towards the end, like I listened to this on audiobook. I had to take my glasses off because I was tearing up at how amazing everything was as it was coming together at the end. And I still stand by that. The two things that I love so much, and they're both related. First off, the way that Angeline Boulley centers the culture and how important Donis's culture is to her makes this such a beautiful book. And then the second is that payoff when things start coming together and it is very closely tied to the culture. This is an amazing book, and it's one of the very first books that I read the whole year. Is stunning. Absolutely stunning book. At number 3, we have another whole author and her series. I have one of the series. Spoiler alert, it's Robin Hobb. I have one of the series here, and that is the Live Ship Traders series. This is the only one of the series in the Realm of the Elder Rings that every single book received 5 stars. So this is my top series. I am not going to hold up all of them. Instead, I'm just going to choose Mad Ship because I believe I rated Mad Ship the highest. Robin Hobb is also an author I discovered this year because of BookTube. And I decided, because I had been catching up on a lot of the backlist videos from creators that I follow, and a lot of the creators that I follow were participating in a book club where every other month they read Robin Hobb. One of those was Back in the Books. And I decided I want to read these. And so I started with the Farseer trilogy and fell head over heels for this story. It sounds like, oh, amazing, loving. No, it's tortured. The thing that I love the most about Robin Hobb's writing is her character work. She has the best character work I have ever read, hands down, in all of the books that I have ever read. Her character work is brilliant. And the way that she builds her fantasy worlds and keeps building and makes allusions to the past is phenomenal. The Live Ship Traders is the second of the trilogies, and you go to a completely separate area, but there's still a connection with the Farseer trilogy. And once you figure out that connection, your mind is blown and everything starts making so much sense. So at the time that I read the Live Ship Traders, I knew so little about the Realm of the Elderlings. It has unfolded so magnificently. I am one book away at the time of filming from finishing the Realm of the Elderlings. That will mean in 1 year, starting around April, I have read the entire Realm of the Elderlings. When I find something that I love, I go full force into it. Robin Hobb is absolutely masterful. And so now we come to my number 2 and my number 1. One of those is the recent edition that caused me to have to shift this whole list. The other is one that I read at the beginning of the year. They're both very similar and very different. Even up to starting to film this, I hadn't decided which one was going to be number 2 and which one was going to be number 1. They are practically tied. I've made a decision. I might go back on it later. I don't think I will. They are, for all intents and purposes, tied at number 1. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tie them at number 1. I'm not going to say one is number 2 or better than the other. They are both tied at number 1. The first one that I'll talk about is the more recent read, and that is Babel. I knew as soon as I heard this book talked about that I would love this book, hands down. The fact that I didn't continue on with Poppy War Trilogy didn't put me off. I could see how amazing that writing was. It just wasn't the story for me. This book, however, is literally the story for me. I cannot think of a book that better appeals to things that I love than this book. You have history, you have linguistics, and you have fantasy. The way that R.F. Kuang deals with everything that's laid out is done in such a poignant, brilliant manner. And again, I think I'm also discovering that I don't necessarily like super happy books because R.F. Kuang does not write anything close to super happy books. I mean, you think about, I've got Babel and I've got The Realm of the Elderlings. Babel tells the story, it's light fantasy, but I think it's more fantasy than a lot of people talk about, and it's silver working. And it tells the story of the British Empire with one minor change, and that is the fantasy. And that is the idea of silver working, where it gets its power from translation. So you take two words that mean the same thing when they are translated, but there's other meanings, and the words in each language do not fully capture the meaning of the other. And that missing portion is what powers everything. It's what powers the magic. And what they are discovering at Babel, which is a tower, a school in Oxford, as all the languages that they've known, all the different Romance languages, as they are more spoken by a wide variety of people, those differences are lessening, which means their magic could become less potent, which means they need to find other pairs of words that have those same meanings, but also the differences to power their magic, which is what sends England on its empire creation to go to those other places and take control those languages and power their magic. And who does it benefit? It benefits the colonizer. This is an absolutely stunning book. I did not read this version. I read the audiobook, which is very well done. And I think for books that have footnotes in them, I would prefer the audiobook version because the audiobook does have two separate narrators. And I have a tendency to not necessarily read the footnote when it's supposed to be read, but when you're reading it as audiobook, you can't miss that. The way that it ends, it really could not end any other way. And it's such a powerful story that left me thinking about it for quite some time. And to me, that is what makes a top book. Which leaves my other number 1 book, which now that I think about it, is incredibly similar. And it's a book I read at the beginning of the year. How the Word Is Passed. This book I also read as an audiobook. And I had every intention of reading it again and annotating it, but I had so many other books and I never got around to it. I don't reread often. Ironically, my mom has read this twice. I read it just once. I'm the one that recommended it to her. How the Word Is Passed. The subtitle is A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. So Clint Smith is a poet by training, and he is a journalist. He took it upon himself to go to various places that are significant in the history of slavery and race relations. And he analyzed how the story is told. Not the actual events, but how people convey those events. And that is something that I try to do when I go to museums, because I've studied a lot of history. It's something I'm really interested in. And so it's not like I go to museums to learn new facts, but I want to look and see how it is portrayed, how people are telling the story. And that's what he tells in here. And the way that he tells it is so lyrical and beautiful, poignant and hard-hitting. He frequently would talk to people that you wouldn't expect a man like him to talk to and to interact with. But he lets them tell their story. He doesn't make any judgment calls while he's having the conversation. He really doesn't make a lot of judgment calls in the narrative. He lets those people's words stand for themselves and show the power, both terrible and, well, mostly terrible, of how the history is told and how that has affected long term. This is a book that is probably going to be one of my favorite nonfiction books, probably of all time, which is why I'm talking about it last in this video. There are my top 10 books of 2022. It was an amazing year. I read some phenomenal books, and I cannot wait to see what kinds of books that I come across in 2023. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.